In the vast panorama of antiquity, few confrontations carry such an intense symbolic weight as the Battle of Marathon, fought in the year 490 before Christ, in a setting that would forever change the way the world understood the struggle between freedom and domination. More than just a clash between two armies, this confrontation represented a collision of cultures, of values, and of radically different ways of life. On one side stood the immense Persian Empire, a powerful war machine, organized and determined to expand its dominion to the very limits of Greece. On the other, a relatively small city-state, deeply proud, standing almost entirely alone in the face of a challenge that seemed impossible to overcome. Over the coming hours, this narrative will guide us through every detail of this legendary battle, exploring not only the combat itself, but also the motivations, the preparations, the consequences, and the legacy that this episode left for all of Western civilization. The year 490 before Christ was a moment of maximum tension in the Eastern Mediterranean. Persian power had become almost absolute, dominating vast regions from the Middle East to parts of Central Asia, reaching Egypt and pressing against Greece through its influence over the Ionian cities. For Darius I, the King of Kings, the submission of the Greek cities was not just a strategic ambition. It was a message to all peoples who dared to rebel against his authority. Athens, recently consolidated as a democratic center, represented for the Persians an uncomfortable symbol, a focus of resistance that, in the eyes of the empire, had to be extinguished before it became a contagious example. This context transformed the plain of Marathon into the stage for a confrontation that would test not only weapons, but also the determination and the very soul of the Athenian people. The landscape of the plain of Marathon held unquestionable strategic importance. Located about 40 kilometers from Athens, it was a broad open space with relatively flat terrain, perfect for a large army to land and reorganize. When the Persian fleet arrived in that region, bringing tens of thousands of soldiers, the threat materialized before the eyes of the Greeks. There was no longer any way to avoid confrontation. And yet, despite the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Persians, something began to take shape in the Athenian mindset. Instead of cowering or retreating, the leaders of the polis decided to march to the battlefield without waiting for Spartan reinforcements, assuming the full risk of war. This act of courage would be remembered for millennia as a landmark of independence and steadfastness in the face of tyranny. The study of the Battle of Marathon shows us that it was not a fortuitous or improvised clash. On the contrary, every detail of the soldiers' positioning, every decision of the generals, and every choice of when and how to attack was shaped by the accumulated experience of the Greeks and by the discipline that characterized them. The courage that would be demonstrated on the battlefield was not born in the heat of the moment, but from the understanding that this fight was the last barrier separating Athens from destruction and submission. Since then, this episode has become a source of inspiration for all of Western civilization, a symbol of the defense of principles and the power of a community united in the face of seemingly insurmountable adversity. To understand Marathon is, therefore, to understand how an unlikely victory can change the course of history. We are not just speaking of a military triumph, but of the reaffirmation of an idea. The idea that a people determined to protect their autonomy and their values can confront any power, no matter how overwhelming it may seem. The memory of Marathon has crossed the centuries, echoing in art, politics, philosophical thought, and popular culture, becoming one of the pillars of what would later be called the Western spirit. As we immerse ourselves in this history, we see that every step leading to the battle and every consequence that followed compose a grand mosaic, a legacy that transcends borders and generations. At the beginning of the 5th century before Christ, the Greek world was a fragmented collection of independent city-states known as polis, spread across the peninsula and the islands of the Aegean Sea. Each polis had its own government, its own laws, its traditions, and even specific protective deities, which made Greece a land united by a common language and culture, yet deeply divided in practice. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and many other cities did not form a single kingdom nor obey a central leader. Instead, they lived in a delicate balance of alliances and rivalries, frequently fighting internal conflicts while maintaining a certain respect for their shared origins. This political diversity was both their strength and their weakness. It allowed the flourishing of democracy, commerce, arts, and philosophy, but it also made it difficult to form a united front in the face of external threats, such as the one that would come from the Persian East. Life in Greece during this period revolved around deeply rooted values. Honor and personal glory were pursued not only on the battlefield, but also in athletic competitions, poetry, oratory, and politics. The citizens of Athens, for example, took pride in their young democracy, a system of direct participation in public decisions that was still maturing and contrasted with the aristocratic rigidity of other polis such as Sparta. At the same time, worship of the gods was inseparable from daily life. Every action, every decision, and every battle was influenced by the belief that the gods of Olympus guided human destiny, and pleasing them was an essential part of civic and military life. It was in this vibrant, creative, and competitive environment that Athens stood out as a cultural and intellectual center, while Sparta commanded respect for its strict militarism. Despite this cultural flourishing, tensions between the cities were constant. Sparta and Athens competed for influence in the Peloponnese and the Aegean. Corinth controlled important trade routes, and Thebes prided itself on its warrior tradition. These rivalries often erupted into internal battles that weakened Greece as a whole. What these cities rarely realized was that while they fought among themselves, a much larger power was growing to the east, in the plains and palaces of the Persian Empire. When news of Persian expansion arrived and became a concrete reality, only a shared sense of danger was able to unite these cities, albeit temporarily, to defend something greater than local interests, the very idea of Hellenic freedom. Athens, for its part, was at the peak of a transformation. After centuries of aristocratic governments, it had built a recent and fragile democratic system that introduced an absolute novelty for the time, a government in which free citizens had the power to vote and decide the fate of the city. This experience aroused curiosity and pride and gave rise to a new way of thinking. It was not only the city that was being challenged by the arrival of the Persians, but an entire way of life that was taking shape. For the Athenians, losing the battle would mean not only the physical destruction of the city, but also the end of a political and cultural project they were striving to build. This is why, even in isolation, they chose to confront danger in the open field. Greek culture in the 5th century before Christ, marked by the pursuit of excellence, while what they called arete, shaped the mindset of the men who would march to Marathon. In music, in poetry, and in philosophical debates, there was a constant idea that human beings should always strive to surpass their own limits. And in war, this translated into courage, discipline, and strategy. When we speak of the Athenian resistance against Persia, it is not only a military confrontation, but a chapter in which Greek culture, politics, and identity were put to the test in the face of a massive adversary. Before the first clash of spears took place at Marathon, the battle was already being fought in the minds and spirits of the citizens of this fragmented and proud land. At the beginning of the 5th century before Christ, the Persian Empire had already established itself as the greatest power the world had ever seen up to that time. Its rise was the result of decades of successive conquests initiated by the kings Cyrus the Great and Cambyses, who expanded its borders from the plains of Media and Persia to the rich valleys of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the farthest regions of the east. During the reign of Darius I, the empire reached its peak, encompassing territories that stretched from the borders of India to the Aegean Sea, embracing an astonishing diversity of peoples, cultures, and traditions under a single central authority. This colossal expanse allowed the Persians to command practically unlimited military power, fueled by tributes from the satrapies and the loyalty of the local governors who answered directly to the so-called King of Kings. The internal functioning of this empire was an example of organization for that time. Darius structured his dominion into administrative regions called satrapies, governed by satraps who were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and providing men and resources for the Persian army. This well-adjusted machine allowed enormous contingents of troops to be mobilized quickly and enabled the construction of great works such as roads and canals, facilitating communication and the integration of territories. This logistical power was one of the Persian advantages because, unlike the fragmented Greek cities, Persia acted as a single body capable of projecting its influence thousands of kilometers away. Where diplomacy could not reach, military force prevailed. The Persian Empire, however, did not rely solely on its military strength. The court of Darius in Persepolis symbolized wealth and sophistication, luxurious palaces, grandiose gardens, and art that combined different styles of conquered cultures demonstrated a civilization of enormous creative capacity. But behind this opulence, there was also a clear objective: to keep central authority unquestionable. The message was simple and direct. All conquered peoples had to recognize the power of the sovereign and submit to him. This concept was reflected even in military expeditions. The campaigns were not just about territorial expansion, but also about imposing Persian order and punishing those who dared to defy it. Athens and the other Greek cities became targets precisely because they challenged this imperial logic. When Ionia, a region inhabited by Greeks on the coast of Asia Minor, rebelled against the Persians with the support of Athens, King Darius saw in this act not just a local revolt, but a personal affront to his authority. The destruction of Sardis, an important Persian city, by the Ionian rebels fueled a desire for revenge that would become one of the engines of the First Greco-Persian War. From that moment on, Athens came to be seen as a threat that needed to be punished in an exemplary way. At the start of the campaign against Greece, Darius organized an impressive force. His objective was to send a clear message: there would be no place in the world distant enough to hide those who defied Persia. With a large army and a colossal fleet, he launched himself upon the islands of the Aegean Sea, conquering them one by one and slowly advancing toward the heart of mainland Greece. The empire seemed invincible, and this sense of superiority was one of the elements that made the unexpected outcome on the plain of Marathon so striking. For there, on that field, for the first time, Persian expansion would meet an organized and determined resistance that would change the course of history. The reasons that led the Persian Empire to direct its military efforts against Athens were rooted in a combination of political, strategic, and even symbolic factors that had been building up over decades and exploded at the beginning of the 5th century before Christ. To understand why the Persians were so intent on subjugating this specific polis, it is necessary to go back in time and see how the growing Athenian influence in the Greek world clashed with the Persian imperial vision of absolute domination. Athens, although not the most powerful of the Greek cities, had become a troubling center due to the boldness of its people and for having directly interfered in the affairs of Asia Minor, a region under Persian control. This interference was not only a military affront, but also an attack on the prestige of Darius I and on the very idea of supremacy of the King of Kings, who could not allow a small city-state across the sea to challenge his authority. The central episode that ignited the Persian desire for vengeance was the Ionian Revolt, which occurred between 499 and 494 before Christ. The Greek cities of Ionia, dissatisfied with Persian control and encouraged by the spirit of autonomy, so characteristic of the Hellenic world, decided to rebel. Athens and Eretria, despite the distance, sent ships and soldiers to support this uprising, believing they could help weaken Eastern rule. The joint expedition even caused significant damage, such as the destruction of Sardis, an important Persian city. For Darius I, this act was unforgivable. More than a simple local defeat, it was a public insult that wounded the image of the empire. From that moment on, war against Athens became a matter of honor. In addition to this motive of revenge, there were also very clear strategic interests. Greece occupied a privileged geographical position in the eastern Mediterranean, serving as a natural gateway for trade routes and a link between Asia and Europe. Subduing Athens meant opening the way to control other cities, and possibly the entire Hellenic peninsula. From the Persian perspective, controlling this region was not only a political gesture, but also a way to ensure safe access to ports, sea routes, and commercial wealth. The conquest of Athens would also serve as a warning to all other Greek city-states. Any attempt to interfere in the empire's affairs would be crushed. The psychological factor cannot be ignored. For a gigantic empire like Persia, allowing a relatively small city to defy its authority and go unpunished would represent a sign of weakness that could inspire rebellions in other conquered regions. Therefore, Darius's decision was swift and inflexible. Athens needed to be punished in an exemplary way, not only militarily defeated, but destroyed and reduced to ruins so that it would serve as an example. Thus, when the Persian fleet approached the Greek coast in 490 before Christ, the objective was not simply to fight a battle, it was to erase a city and strike its name from history. Therefore, the Persian attack on Greece cannot be seen as a mere desire for expansion. It was a dangerous combination of wounded pride, strategic interest, and the need to reaffirm the absolute authority of Darius I. However, the Persians underestimated the Greek spirit and the determination of a small city to face the most powerful enemy of its time. This decision, which seemed a guaranteed victory, turned into what history would later call one of the greatest symbols of resistance ever recorded. The First Greco-Persian War, as the initial series of clashes between Greeks and Persians came to be known, was the broader context in which the Battle of Marathon took place. This conflict did not arise overnight. It was the result of years of accumulated tension between two worlds that, although separated by the Aegean Sea, had increasingly conflicting interests. On one side stood the vast and centralized Persian Empire, stretching across continents and seeing expansion as a means to ensure its security and authority. On the other side, the independent and fragmented Greek cities lived in constant disputes among themselves, but shared a fierce defense of their autonomy. When these two forces collided, there was no room for prolonged negotiations. War became inevitable. The spark of this conflict, as we have already seen, was the Ionian Revolt, when Greek cities in Asia Minor rebelled against Persian rule. The support given by Athens and Eretria to this rebellion turned a local dispute into an international matter. The revolt was harshly suppressed by Darius I, but it left a deep scar on Persian pride, because for the first time a distant people had defied the authority of the King of Kings and managed to cause real damage. After the suppression, the empire not only re-established order, but began preparing a punitive campaign to destroy the cities that dared to support it. This desire for vengeance shaped the First Greco-Persian War, whose main objective was to punish Athens and Eretria, and then consolidate Persian presence in mainland Greece. The war began with a large-scale naval campaign. In 492 before Christ, a first Persian expedition was sent under the command of Mardonius, son-in-law of Darius, to subjugate the Greeks. This fleet, however, was severely hit by a storm while still sailing near Thrace, destroying much of its ships and forcing a retreat. This initial setback did not shake Darius's determination, but it postponed the invasion by 2 years. In 490 before Christ, a new and much better prepared expedition was sent, this time under the command of Datis and Artaphernes. The strategy was clear. First punish the rebellious cities and then force the remaining Greek polis to surrender. The Persian fleet crossed the Aegean Sea, conquering islands along the way with a mixture of intimidation and force. When it reached Eretria, the city was besieged, taken, and devastated. The Persians deported its inhabitants, showing the rest of Greece what would happen to anyone who dared to resist. The next target was Athens, and for that, the Persians chose the plain of Marathon as their landing point. This location allowed them to organize their troops far from the city walls while maintaining a safe base close to the sea. Upon learning of the enemy's arrival, the Athenians quickly marched to Marathon to block the passage and prevent the Persian army from advancing toward the city. The First Greco-Persian War, therefore, was not just a military conflict. It was a clash between two visions of power. For the Persians, the submission of the Greek cities was inevitable. It was only a matter of demonstrating the crushing strength of the empire. For the Greeks, and especially for Athens, war was the only way to protect the freedom of their city and the dignity of their people. This difference in objectives made the battle even more intense, because the Athenians were not fighting just for a piece of land, but for their very existence and autonomy. At Marathon, this determination would face its ultimate test, giving rise to one of the most memorable episodes in the military history of humanity. The Ionian Revolt is one of the most important chapters for understanding how Persian wrath turned against Greece, and especially against Athens. At the end of the 6th century before Christ, the region of Ionia, located on the coast of Asia Minor, was made up of several cities of Greek origin that had fallen under the control of the Persian Empire during the expansionist campaigns of Cyrus the Great. These cities, even under foreign rule, kept Hellenic traditions and culture alive, preserving their language, their institutions, and a strong sense of identity. However, Persian presence imposed appointed governors, heavy tributes, and political control that, little by little, fueled growing discontent among the local populations. This discontent finally exploded in 499 before Christ, when Aristagoras, the tyrant of Miletus, led a revolt against Persian rule. The uprising was not just an isolated reaction, it quickly gained strength and spread to other Ionian cities, which saw in this opportunity a chance to regain autonomy. But to face an empire as vast as Persia, Ionia needed allies. It was then that Aristagoras sought help in mainland Greece, requesting military and naval support from cities such as Sparta and Athens. Sparta refused, considering the distance and the high risks, but Athens and Eretria accepted the challenge. This decision, which for the Athenians seemed only an act of solidarity with their Greek brothers across the sea, would end up bringing consequences of unimaginable proportions. Athenian support materialized with the sending of ships and soldiers who participated in a daring expedition against the city of Sardis, an important Persian administrative center. The attack was an initial success. The rebels managed to burn part of the city, causing great destruction. However, the Persian reaction was quick and brutal. The imperial troops counterattacked, forcing the Greeks to retreat and starting a long campaign to crush the rebellion. The uprising lasted a few more years, but one by one, the Ionian centers were retaken and subjected to harsh reprisals. In the end, in 494 before Christ, Miletus was besieged and destroyed, symbolically marking the end of the revolt. For the Persians, this episode was not just a local disturbance, but an insult that could never be forgotten. Darius I, upon learning of the involvement of Athens and Eretria in the attack on Sardis, is said to have sworn vengeance. According to ancient accounts, the king ordered that every time he sat down to eat, a servant should say aloud to remind him, "Master, remember the Athenians." This personal vow made Athens a priority target. The destruction of the city became a matter of honor for the empire. It was from this spark that the campaign was born that, years later, would bring the Persian forces to the plain of Marathon. Thus, the Ionian revolt can be seen as the first spark that triggered the so-called Greco-Persian Wars. By deciding to support their Greek brothers in the east, Athens not only put itself on a collision course with the largest empire of its time, but also drew upon itself the vengeance of a monarch who did not tolerate challenges. This choice would forever change the destiny of the Greek world, as it placed a still young city-state at the center of a confrontation that would define the future of Greece and, in many ways, shape the history of Western civilization. Darius I, known in history as the King of Kings, was one of the most influential and powerful monarchs of the entire Persian Empire. His reign, which began in 522 before Christ and lasted until 486 before Christ, consolidated the administrative, economic, and military foundations that transformed Persia into a superpower capable of projecting its influence from the Indus Valley to the borders of Greece. Darius did not inherit the throne as a direct son of Cyrus the Great, but came to power through his political and military ability, reorganizing an empire that, at the time, was shaken by internal revolts. Once on the throne, he restructured the satrapies, created standardized taxation systems, expanded the network of imperial roads, and strengthened trade, allowing the Persian administrative machine to function efficiently, even over long distances. This centralized model made the empire achieve remarkable stability during his reign. In addition to being a skilled administrator, Darius I was a strategist with unlimited ambition. His goal was not only to defend the borders inherited from Cyrus, but to expand them to the known limits of the world. Throughout his life, he led or ordered campaigns in all directions, against the peoples of Central Asia, against Egypt, against the Scythians, and finally, against Greece itself. In each of these campaigns, he sought both territorial conquest and the demonstration of power. Darius was fully aware that governing such a vast empire required, beyond administrative organization, the construction of an image of invincibility. That is why every challenge to his authority was dealt with exemplary rigor. For him, punishing rebels was a necessary act to maintain order and intimidate any attempt at resistance. On the military front, Darius's Persian Empire was a colossal force. The diversity of peoples that made up the empire was reflected in its army: Medes, Persians, Elamites, Babylonians, Egyptians, Lydians, Scythians, Indians, and many other peoples contributed specialized warriors. This variety gave the Persian army an unusual flexibility, as there were renowned archers, fast cavalry, heavy infantry, and engineers capable of building bridges and roads in record time. Logistics was one of the army's strengths, because well-planned roads allowed resources, weapons, and information to be transported from one end of the empire to the other at impressive speeds for the time. The Persian navy, in turn, controlled the maritime routes of the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean with hundreds of ships. Darius also made a point of projecting an image of almost divine authority. In the inscriptions left by him, such as those carved at Persepolis and Behistun, he always appears as a just ruler, chosen by Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Zoroastrianism, to govern over all peoples. This sacred character reinforced the idea that disobeying the king was equivalent to disobeying the very order of the universe. Such a view contributed to obedience and cohesion within the empire, but also explained why an act of rebellion like that of the Athenians could not go unpunished. It was a challenge to the very divine structure that sustained Persian power. Darius's decision to attack Greece was not just military. It involved pride, ideology, and the certainty that Persia was destined to rule over all. For him, victory at Marathon would not only be a territorial conquest, but a symbol that no people could rise above Persian power. What he did not expect was that this encounter on the plains of Attica would put to the test everything he believed to be absolute, revealing that the discipline and courage of a determined people could change the course of history. After the brutal suppression of the Ionian revolt and the destruction of Miletus, Darius I turned his attention to a far bolder objective: to take the war directly to the heart of Greece. For him, this move was not only a matter of vengeance, but a long-term strategic decision. The presence of independent and defiant city-states on the other side of the Aegean Sea was a potential threat to Persian stability, because it showed other peoples that it was possible to resist the power of the empire. Subjugating Greece meant eliminating this focus of rebellion, while ensuring a safe corridor for trade and Persian expansion to the west. The planning of the campaign was meticulous. Darius knew that conquering a mountainous land full of rival cities would require a very well-organized naval operation. Instead of marching by land, as he had done in previous campaigns, he decided that the first major offensive against the Greeks would come by sea. This decision allowed the Persians to choose the landing site, avoid the narrow passes of northern Greece, and advance rapidly against the main targets. For this purpose, a massive fleet was assembled, composed of hundreds of triremes and transport ships, carrying not only soldiers, but also horses, supplies, and engineers to build camps and fortifications wherever necessary. Before the second expedition, however, there was a first attempt in 492 before Christ. This initial campaign, led by Mardonius, aimed to subjugate the cities of northern Greece and establish a foothold for a deeper invasion. However, nature intervened. A violent storm struck the fleet near Mount Athos, destroying a large part of the ships. This defeat was not caused by the Greeks, but it showed that even Persian power could be halted by forces beyond its control. Darius was undeterred. He reorganized the plans, reinforced the fleet, and began preparing an even larger offensive. The second expedition, the one that would culminate in the Battle of Marathon, set out in 490 before Christ. This time, command was given to two experienced generals, Datis and Artaphernes. The chosen route passed through the Cycladic Islands, subjugating each one of them and securing support bases before reaching the Greek mainland coast. This campaign had clear targets: first to punish Eretria, which had supported the Ionians in their revolt, and then to destroy Athens. Eretria was besieged, conquered, and razed without great difficulty, serving as a warning to other cities. The Persians deported the inhabitants of the city, demonstrating that resistance would result in annihilation. With the path cleared, the Persian fleet proceeded to the plain of Marathon. There, the geography offered ideal conditions for a safe landing: a wide, flat space to reorganize the troops and close enough to Athens to threaten it directly. The intention was simple and direct: land, organize the army, and march to the city, which, without support, seemed doomed. The Persians were certain that numerical superiority and their reputation for invincibility would be enough to intimidate any attempt at resistance. However, What the Persian commanders did not expect was the courageous decision of the Athenians. Instead of waiting behind the walls and allowing the enemy to advance to the city, they marched to intercept the Persians and confront them right there, on the plain. This choice would completely change the course of events. The meeting of two worlds was about to happen, and neither force imagined that the outcome of that confrontation would enter history as one of the most striking moments of antiquity. The Persian fleet assembled for the great campaign of 490 before Christ was an impressive logistical achievement, capable of demonstrating the full power and organization of the Persian Empire. Led by Datis and Artaphernes, this naval force was not merely a collection of warships. It was a true floating city, made up of hundreds of ships carefully prepared to transport soldiers, horses, supplies, and weapons. The Persian structure allowed large-scale mobilization like no other of that time. The warships, mostly triremes and pentaconters, were fast and stable, ideal for naval combat and for the safe transport of troops to landing points. The transport ships carried provisions, horses, and materials necessary for building camps and fortifications as soon as the troops reached land. The goal of the fleet was not to sail directly to Athens. Darius had learned from the experience of the Ionian Revolt that conquering territories required method, security, and patience. Therefore, the campaign began by sea, following a calculated route through the islands of the Aegean. At each stop, the Persians demanded submission from the local populations. Cities and islands that surrendered were spared, while those that resisted were looted and burned. This step-by-step advance consolidated Persian power along the route and prevented any rebellion from cutting off supply lines. At the same time, the imposing presence of the fleet served as a psychological warning. Persian power was drawing ever closer. During the crossing, one of the first remarkable acts was the capture of Naxos, one of the main islands of the Cyclades, which was devastated to serve as an example. From there, the Persians continued to other smaller islands, ensuring there was no risk of attacks on the ships as they advanced. This strategy was not only military, it was also symbolic. With each island subdued, the sense grew that the empire was an inevitable force, capable of crushing any attempt at resistance. This sequence of quick victories built a reputation of invincibility that, from the Persian perspective, would weaken the morale of the Greek cities even before the army landed on the mainland. When the fleet reached Euboea, Eretria became the main target. The city, which had helped Athens during the Ionian Revolt, was besieged and fell in just a few days. The Persians were ruthless. They burned houses and temples, destroyed walls, and deported the entire population far away, sending them as prisoners to the interior of the empire. This action had a double effect. Militarily, it eliminated a potential support point for the Athenians. Psychologically, it showed all Greek cities the fate that awaited those who dared to oppose the King of Kings. After Eretria, there was no doubt Athens would be the next target. With the coast secured and their morale high, the fleet proceeded to the coast of Attica, choosing the plain of Marathon as the ideal landing point. The location allowed for an orderly arrival, quick troop positioning, and easy maneuvering, with the ships serving as a supply line. Meanwhile, in Athens, news of the Persian landing spread panic, but also ignited the flame of resistance. The Athenians knew there was no more time to wait for Spartan reinforcements. They either faced the Persians there, or the city would be destroyed like Eretria. Thus, the Persian advance through the Aegean Sea was much more than a simple movement. It was a campaign planned to intimidate, subdue, and prepare the ground for a final strike that was intended to be swift and exemplary. However, upon arriving at Marathon, the Persians did not find a terrified city, but an Athenian army ready to fight to the end, beginning one of the most legendary chapters in military history. When news of the Persian landing at Marathon reached Athens, the city was immediately gripped by tension. The Athenian leaders knew they were about to face a military force far larger than their own, a force that had already reduced Eretria to ashes and deported its entire population. The choice before them was extremely harsh: wait for Spartan reinforcements and risk the Persians marching to the city walls, destroying everything in their path, or make the bold decision to move quickly to block them, confronting them in open terrain despite being at a clear numerical disadvantage. This was one of the boldest decisions in Athenian history, a moment when politics and war became inseparable. As soon as they learned of the Persian arrival, the Athenians sent a messenger to Sparta to ask for help. This messenger, named Phidippides, ran an impressive distance to Laconia, carrying news of the invasion and an urgent plea for assistance. However, upon arriving there, the Spartans gave an unexpected response. They could not send troops immediately because they were in the middle of the Carnea, an important religious festival that, by Spartan laws and traditions, forbade them from going to war until the full moon. Thus, although willing to help, they promised to depart only after a few days, when the festival ended. For Athens, this meant fighting alone at the most critical moment. With this message in hand, the Athenian leaders, under the command of the strategos Miltiades, called an assembly and decided to face the situation directly. They understood that if they waited behind the walls, the Persians would have the freedom to plunder the surrounding lands, choose the right moment to attack, and perhaps even find local allies. Marching to Marathon meant anticipating the confrontation, forcing the battle in open terrain, and preventing the enemy from advancing toward the city. This decision was not only military, but also psychological. It demonstrated that Athens would not cower, even in the face of an enemy considered invincible. The Athenian march to Marathon was swift and determined. Approximately 10,000 hoplites marched, accompanied by a small contingent from Plataea, the only allied city that promptly responded to their call. These men were fully aware that no reinforcements were coming and that on the battlefield they would be outnumbered. Still, their confidence in the discipline of the phalanx and in the skill of their generals sustained them. Upon reaching the plain, the Greeks occupied a strategic position between the hills and the marsh, blocking the Persian exit and forcing them to face the battle head-on. This isolated decision by Athens became a landmark. It was the moment when a small city-state decided, without any guarantee of immediate support, to confront the greatest power of the ancient world. This courage also had an unexpected effect. It forced the Persians to fight in terrain, where they could not fully use all of their advantages, such as their cavalry, which would become a complicated element in the narrow space and difficult terrain. More than ever, the battle ceased to be just a clash of armies and became a test of character and determination. The Athenian isolation in the face of this threat shaped the entire narrative that followed. Without Sparta at that crucial moment, without reinforcements from other Greek cities, Athens took upon itself the role of the last barrier between the freedom of Greece and submission to the Persian Empire. From that moment on, the plain of Marathon was transformed into a field of honor, where the courage of a few would challenge the strength of many. The plain of Marathon, chosen by the Persians as a landing point and by the Athenians as a defensive line, was not just any battlefield. Located approximately 40 kilometers northeast of Athens, this strip of land stretched between the Aegean Sea and a series of low hills that blocked the way toward the interior. At first glance, for an army landing from the sea, Marathon seemed perfect. An open, flat, wide space ideal for reorganizing troops, unloading supplies, and allowing cavalry and archers to operate in large formations. However, what seemed to be an advantage also became a challenge, because the topography, the marshes, and the natural narrowing of the terrain at the edges created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those familiar with the region. From a geographical point of view, the plain had some very specific characteristics. On the eastern side, it was open to the sea, facilitating the arrival of the Persian fleet. Further inland, hills and areas of vegetation limited maneuvering space, while on the sides there were marshlands and channels of water that made broader movements difficult, especially for cavalry formations. To the south and west, the terrain narrowed the path toward Athens. Thus, nature itself created a bottleneck. Any Persian advance inland would inevitably be channeled through narrower passes, exactly what the Athenians needed to reduce the enemy's numerical advantage. Another important aspect was the climate. Late summer in Greece was dry and hot during the day, but cooler at night. This caused soldiers to tire more quickly under the intense sun, especially the Persians, who wore lighter armor and relied on long supply lines from their ships. For the Athenian hoplites, accustomed to marching on irregular terrain and trained to endure long journeys, this climatic condition could become a factor in their favor in terms of physical endurance. The terrain of Marathon also represented a strategic choice for Athens. By moving their troops to this location, Miltiades and the other generals not only prevented the Persians from marching directly to Athens, but also forced the confrontation far from the city walls, protecting the civilian population. Furthermore, by positioning their army in a narrower space, the Athenians reduced the possibility of a siege and forced the Persians to attack head-on. Geography made the battle more balanced than expected for two armies so disproportionate in numbers. The choice of this battlefield also allowed the Greeks to take advantage of their greatest asset, the phalanx formation. In open terrain, but limited laterally, this dense formation of hoplites worked like a moving wall of bronze and shields, able to absorb archer attacks and push enemies in close combat. For the Persians, accustomed to more open battles with a greater reliance on archers and cavalry, the irregular ground and the impossibility of deploying their full numerical superiority greatly reduced the advantages they expected to have. Thus, Marathon was not just the stage of the battle, it was a decisive factor in its outcome. Every detail of the terrain and geography weighed on the strategic planning of the Athenians, who even with far fewer numbers, found there a field where courage, discipline, and knowledge of the land could compensate for the immense difference in strength. On that silent plain, surrounded by hills and the sea, an army of citizens marched, knowing that there the fate of Greece would be decided. At the heart of the Athenian resistance at Marathon were its generals, men chosen by the polis not only for their military skill, but also for their ability to inspire confidence in times of crisis. The Athenian military structure provided that 10 strategoi, one from each tribe of the city, would command the army collectively, and above them, as a balancing figure, was the polemarch, a supreme commander who had the casting vote in strategic decisions. However, at Marathon, one figure stood out, someone whose experience and tactical vision would shape the outcome of the battle: Miltiades. He had served as a commander in Thrace and was well acquainted with the Persian style of warfare, which gave him a clear understanding that defeating this enemy would not depend on brute strength, but on cunning and discipline. Miltiades' leadership was decisive from the moment Athens decided to march to Marathon. Many of the strategoi were cautious, fearing the Persian numerical power and suggesting that it would be safer to wait for Spartan reinforcements behind the city walls. Miltiades, however, argued that the worst choice was to wait. He saw time as the Persians' greatest ally, because each passing day allowed them to disembark more troops, set up camps, and strengthen their positions. Attacking while the Persians were still settling their forces was, for him, the only way to balance the scales. The vision of this general convinced the majority, and his determination transformed a defensive attitude into a bold strategy. Once established in the field of Marathon, Miltiades demonstrated great organizational skill. He arranged the Athenian troops in an extended line, but with a feature different from the traditional standard. He deliberately reinforced the wings, the flanks, and left the center thinner. This decision, seemingly risky, was the result of his knowledge of Persian tactics. He knew that the Persian center, reinforced by their best troops, would try to break through the Athenian core. With a deliberately lighter center, he planned a pincer maneuver as soon as the Greek flanks managed to advance. This strategy required absolute discipline from the hoplites and an unshakable confidence that every man would hold his position even under the overwhelming pressure of the enemy. In addition to Miltiades, it is important to highlight the role of the other generals and of the polemarch Callimachus. The decision to give Miltiades the authority to command at the right moment was only possible thanks to a vote among them in which they recognized his clearer vision of the situation. Callimachus, by using his casting vote in favor of the proposed offensive, also became an essential part of the history of Marathon, as his decision allowed Athens to take the initiative. This combination of collective leadership and the confidence placed in an experienced commander was a distinctive feature rarely seen in armies of such different cultures. The discipline of the hoplites, trained to fight as a unit and not as isolated individuals, complemented this leadership. Each soldier knew that his survival depended on keeping his shield close to that of his companion, on not breaking formation, and on following the cadence of orders. This ability to act in perfect synchrony was what allowed the Athenians to execute complex tactical maneuvers even in the chaos of the battlefield. In contrast, the Persian army, despite being large and diverse, found it difficult to coordinate precise movements when facing such compact formations. Leadership at Marathon, therefore, was not an act of isolated bravery, but the result of strategic vision, political courage, and collective discipline. Without these qualities, the 10,000 Athenians and Plataeans would never have been able to confront a much larger force and turn it into a victory that would echo through the centuries as a symbol of resistance. The Athenian army that faced the Persians at Marathon was composed mainly of hoplites, the most characteristic type of soldier in the Greek city-states at the time. The term hoplite comes from hoplon, the large round shield they carried, which became the central element both for individual defense and for collective protection in battle formations. Hoplite warfare represented a style of combat based on discipline, training, and solidarity among soldiers, very different from the light mobile warfare of the Persian armies. To understand why the hoplite formation was so decisive at Marathon, it is necessary to look at the equipment and military philosophy that shaped these fighters. Each hoplite carried a set of heavy armaments. The shield, made of wood and covered with bronze, measured about 1 meter in diameter and had a central grip that allowed it to rest on the shoulder, protecting both the bearer and part of the soldier next to him. This overlap of shields created an almost impenetrable wall when the formation was tightly closed. In addition, the hoplites wore bronze or thick linen breastplates, greaves to protect their legs, and a helmet that covered most of the face, leaving only a narrow opening for the eyes. The main weapon was a spear, usually between 2 and 3 meters long, used to strike over or between the shields. As a secondary weapon, they carried a short sword for close combat when the distance to the enemy disappeared. But more important than the equipment was the formation the hoplites used, the phalanx. This formation consisted of compact ranks of soldiers, each partially protected by the shield of the companion to the left, creating a unit that advanced as a single mass. In this structure, individuality disappeared. A soldier's value was not measured only by his personal skill, but by his ability to hold his position, follow orders, and not break the line even under the most intense pressure. When the phalanx was well organized, it became a moving wall of bronze, able to withstand arrows and crush looser formations. Hoplite training began early. Athenian citizens were called to prepare physically and mentally for the defense of the city. As in Greece, there were no standing armies in the same way as in the Persian Empire. In times of war, it was the citizens themselves who armed and marched to fight. This direct connection between the soldier and the city meant that motivation was much greater. They were defending their homes, their families, and the very survival of their culture. At Marathon, this connection proved to be a powerful force because each soldier knew there was no defensive line behind them. If they failed, Athens would fall. Meanwhile, Persian strategy relied much more on mobility, archers, and light cavalry, styles of combat that depended on room to maneuver. In open, wide terrain, these tactics were devastating, but in more limited terrain, and against a solid formation such as the phalanx, Persian advantages were greatly diminished. Hoplite discipline, the ability to hold formation even under a rain of arrows, and the willingness to fight in close combat were factors that neutralized much of the enemy's numerical advantage. Thus, at Marathon, the Athenian and Plataean hoplites demonstrated what this type of soldier could achieve when led by experienced commanders and motivated by an existential cause. Every shield, every spear, and every firm step in the formation represented the idea that together, even a small number of citizens could face a gigantic empire. This philosophy of fighting, based on cohesion and discipline, turned the battle into one of the most impressive pages in the military history of antiquity. The Persian army that landed at Marathon was an impressive force in numbers, diversity, and logistics, representing one of the most feared military machines of antiquity. Unlike the Athenian army, formed essentially by citizen soldiers fighting for their own city, the Persian force was a mosaic of conquered peoples and allies, united under the command of the King of Kings. This diversity was one of the empire's greatest strengths. Each contingent brought its own specialties, weapons, combat techniques, and styles of fighting, creating a varied and adaptable composition. Ancient estimates, often exaggerated, speak of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Modern historians consider smaller numbers, but still far superior to that of the Greeks, possibly between 20,000 and 30,000 combatants, including infantry, archers, and cavalry. The Persian infantry was notable for its lightness and mobility. Unlike the heavily armed Greek hoplites, the Persians used light armor made of hardened leather or metal scales over fabric, which gave them speed for maneuvering in open fields. Their main weapons were composite bows, capable of shooting arrows long distances with precision, and shorter spears as well as swords and daggers. This strategy allowed them to wear down the enemy from a distance before closing in for hand-to-hand combat. This form of fighting worked well against disorganized enemies, but struggled against a formation as tight and disciplined as the hoplite phalanx. Another notable component was the Persian archers, who formed lines and launched a rain of arrows capable of darkening the sky, a tactic designed to weaken the enemy before direct confrontation. In addition, the Persian cavalry, considered one of the best of antiquity, played a decisive role on battlefields. With fast horses and experienced riders, they could flank enemies, break fragile formations, and pursue fleeing troops. At Marathon, however, the presence of the cavalry was limited by the narrow terrain and the rapid action of the Greeks, a detail that would prove crucial in the outcome of the battle. The multicultural composition of the Persian army included Medes, Elamites, Egyptians, Babylonians, Scythians, and even contingents from India, each contributing with their own combat style. This diversity, though powerful, also required a high degree of coordination, which was not always simple on the battlefield, especially when facing compact and organized opponents. To compensate for this difficulty, the Persians relied heavily on their hierarchical discipline and the experience of their commanders, who had messengers and officers at their disposal to quickly transmit orders during battle. The Persians also had an elite contingent known as the Immortals. This permanent corps, composed of 10,000 men, received special training and served as the king's personal guard and as the most reliable line in combat. They were called Immortals because when one fell, another immediately took his place, keeping the number constant. Although there are doubts about whether such a specific contingent was present at Marathon, it is certain that among the Persian forces there were elite troops trained to maintain the army's cohesion and morale. This impressive force made the Persian invasion a threat that seemed irresistible to the small Greek cities. However, the advantages that worked so well in large open spaces became more limited on the plain of Marathon. Overconfidence, the difficulty of coordinating such a varied force in narrow terrain, and the underestimation of Athenian determination combined with a factor that even the most experienced generals could not anticipate, the bold strategy of Miltiades, which would completely overturn expectations for that confrontation. For several days after the landing of the Persian forces on the plain of Marathon, a dense atmosphere of expectation settled over that part of Attica. The battle, which everyone knew was inevitable, seemed suspended in time, as if the air filled with dust and sea salt held the very destiny of Greece. Upon arrival, the Persians disembarked their troops, organized their camps, and prepared to advance toward Athens. On the other side, in an elevated position that allowed them to observe every movement of the enemy, the Athenians, alongside the Plataeans, set up their camp. It was a tense, silent wait, where neither side wanted to be the first to act rashly. Every passing hour was a test of courage, a psychological game in which any sign of weakness could decide the war before a single spear was thrown. The Persians had an evident numerical advantage and counted on it to intimidate. As the days dragged on, they expected fear to eat away at Greek morale, forcing them to retreat or surrender even before the clash. For the Persians, time was a weapon. Each day of waiting meant more supplies unloaded, more space for reorganization, and more opportunities to find weaknesses in Athenian morale. There was also the expectation that the cavalry might find an opening to move, or that an act of betrayal inside Athens might facilitate their advance without the need for a frontal battle. For the Greeks, however, the strategy was the exact opposite. Miltiades knew that he could not rush into an attack. Despite his boldness, he understood that attacking without preparation could be fatal, as it would give the Persians a chance to use their full advantage in archers and cavalry. By holding their positions during those days, he gained time to study the enemy's movements, to observe the deployment of their troops, and to identify the moment when the Persian advantage could be reduced. This period was also important to strengthen the soldiers' confidence. Each night spent at Marathon was another night that Athens remained intact, and another night in which the courage of its citizens solidified. Conditions in the field were harsh. The late summer heat burned during the day, and the tense silence was broken only by the sound of waves crashing on the beach and the creaking of war equipment. The dust raised by the movements of horses and Persian troops hung in the air, and occasionally the wind carried the smell of smoke from the campfires. On both sides, the soldiers knew they were facing a decisive moment. Each day, glances met from a distance, and hatred and determination grew alongside fear. It was during this waiting period that the most intense debates arose among the Athenian command. Some generals wanted to remain on the defensive, waiting for the Spartan reinforcements that would only arrive after the full moon. Others, led by Miltiades, argued that it was necessary to attack before the Persians found a way out of the plain, or before their cavalry was fully ready to maneuver. These days were crucial to the decision that would change everything, the choice to attack at an unexpected moment, taking advantage of a gap created by the Persian reorganization. In the end, this waiting was not passivity. It was a psychological and strategic duel in which each side sought to read the other. The Persians relied on their power and on the pressure of time. The Athenians relied on moral endurance and the precise choice of the right moment to act. When the battle finally began, it was neither by chance nor improvisation. It was born out of the tension accumulated during those silent days, when both armies measured each other without moving a muscle, like predators waiting for the exact moment to strike. The decisive moment came when Miltiades realized that prolonged hesitation would only favor the Persians. Carefully observing the enemy camp and the daily movements of their troops, he noticed that at a certain point, part of the Persian cavalry had been re-embarked onto the ships, probably for a maneuver or redistribution. This temporary absence meant that, for a few hours, the most dangerous element of the Persian army would not be available on the battlefield. It was the opening the Greeks needed, and in that instant, Miltiades made the decision that would enter history to order an immediate frontal attack before the Persians could reorganize their lines. The order took everyone by surprise, including the hoplites themselves, who until then had maintained a defensive position. At dawn, the Athenian formation was aligned, stretching out in a long line approximately 1 kilometer wide. Miltiades reinforced the flanks and left the center lighter, creating a risky but brilliant strategy. The idea was simple: allow the center to endure the Persian pressure just long enough for the flanks to envelop and crush the enemy's sides. This maneuver required extreme discipline and courage, as the pressure on the center would be brutal. Then a command was given, and the scene that followed became legendary. The hoplites began advancing toward the enemy at a fast pace, which quickly turned into a run. It is estimated that they covered about 1 kilometer running, something never seen before in warfare at that time, especially with soldiers carrying heavy armor. This charge had a very clear purpose: to reduce as much as possible the time during which the Athenians would be exposed to the rain of Persian arrows. Before the archers could unleash a deadly sequence of shots, the hoplite line was already close enough for hand-to-hand combat. The image was striking. For the Persians, accustomed to seeing their enemies wait passively while being bombarded with arrows, that compact mass of soldiers running silently, with shields raised and spears pointed forward, must have been a terrifying sight. Surprise turned into chaos, and the momentum of the fast-advancing hoplites neutralized the preparation of the Persian archers. Within moments, the two lines collided with a metallic crash, and the fight was no longer at a distance. The battle was now fought in brutal close combat, where the Greek formation held the advantage. This tactical choice also had a deep psychological meaning. By launching the attack, Athens showed the enemy that they were not there to resist, but to win. The charge, despite being exhausting, boosted the morale of the soldiers themselves, who felt in control of the initiative. The initial impact was so strong that the Persian flanks began to collapse almost immediately. Meanwhile, in the center, the fighting was more intense, as the Persians' most experienced troops tried to break through the thinner hoplite line. This moment, the march turned into a charge, was the turning point of the entire campaign. The Athenians chose the unexpected, and the unexpected completely disrupted the Persian plan. It was the moment when courage replaced numerical inferiority, and surprise became a weapon as powerful as spears and shields. The Battle of Marathon, which had seemed destined to be a massacre, turned into an open, balanced and bloody duel from this bold movement onward. The clash between the two armies on the plain of Marathon was so sudden and fierce that within minutes the battlefield was transformed into a scene of chaos, screams and steel against steel. When the Greek hoplites, after their rapid advance, collided with the Persian lines, the tactical superiority of the Athenians began to reveal itself. The phalanx, with its interlocked shields and spears thrust forward, moved like a wall of bronze in motion. On the other side, the Persians, accustomed to weakening their enemies with archers and striking with light cavalry, now faced a force that neither retreated nor allowed distance, forcing hand-to-hand combat, the very kind of battle where their light armor and short spears became fatal disadvantages. The first Persian line tried to hold the impact, but their formation was not built to withstand continuous frontal pressure. The Persian center, where the most experienced and numerous troops were positioned, advanced confidently against the central part of the Athenian line, which had been intentionally made thinner. Initially, the Greeks in that section began to give ground slightly, as Miltiades had planned. But while the Greek center retreated in a controlled manner, the heavily reinforced flanks advanced on both sides, enveloping the Persian flanks. Within minutes, the Persian army found itself trapped in an inverted U-shape, with the Greeks pressing on three sides. This maneuver was decisive. The phalanx, by closing the sides, completely disorganized the Persian line. The soldiers of the empire, who fought more loosely spaced and without a mutual protection system, began to lose stability. Panic spread through the ranks, and the shouts of command could no longer be heard. The hoplites, on the other hand, advanced slowly, maintaining the cohesion of the formation even when they had the upper hand. The idea was not to run after fleeing enemies, but to hold the shield wall steady, using their collective weight to push and crush. The terrain also favored the Greeks. The marshy areas on the flanks made any Persian attempt at maneuvering or orderly retreat extremely difficult. Many soldiers became stuck in the mud, others fell and were trampled by their own troops. With no effective cavalry at that moment, and with the archers rendered useless in such close combat, the Persians no longer had a way to respond. What had been an ordered formation turned into a disorganized mass of men trying to escape the relentless pressure of the phalanx. The fighting continued for hours. Although some parts of the Persian line collapsed quickly, others resisted with determination. But the Greeks were fighting for their city, for their families, for their freedom. That motivation, added to the effectiveness of the formation and their knowledge of the terrain, made them practically unstoppable. In the end, when most of the Persian troops had been pushed back to the ships or slaughtered in the fields and marshes, the Athenians still held their formation intact, with casualties significantly lower than expected. The result of the battle was astonishing. About 6,400 Persians killed against approximately 200 Greeks, a number almost symbolic compared to the challenge they had faced. The victory at Marathon was not only a military surprise, it was proof that organization, courage, and the right tactical choices, even with numerical inferiority, could defeat an overwhelmingly superior enemy. More than that, Marathon became the symbol of Greece's resistance against the Eastern Empire, proving that freedom and autonomy could be successfully defended. The strategy Miltiades conceived at Marathon, which would become legendary, consisted of a bold redesign of the traditional hoplite formation. Unlike the usual arrangement, in which the center was the strongest point of the line, he deliberately chose to weaken that area and concentrate most of his forces on the wings. At first glance, this choice seemed like an invitation to disaster. A thin center could easily be broken, and once the line was breached, the phalanx would lose its cohesion. However, Miltiades was not relying on brute force, but on psychology and the engineering of the battlefield. He knew that Athenian discipline could withstand the initial pressure long enough for the flanks to execute the decisive move that would change everything. When the hoplite charge ended and the armies clashed, the Persian center, composed of the empire's most numerous and heavily armed troops, pressed strongly against the Greek center. As predicted, the Athenian corps yielded a few meters, resisting but retreating slowly. This made the Persians advance deeper, confident that they were about to completely break the defenses. Meanwhile, the Athenian flanks, reinforced with more soldiers and a greater density of shields and spears, moved forward quickly, crushing the Persian wings. The Persian formation, stretched out and dependent on mobility, began to lose stability at the edges, and at that moment Miltiades' maneuver came into action. The Greek wings closed in, creating a pincer movement. This technique turned the Persian flanks into a funnel of destruction. With the sides broken, the Greeks began to encircle the Persian troops, now attacking from the sides and in some points even from behind. What had initially seemed an advantage, the Persian penetration into the center, turned into a trap as they were surrounded from three directions. The discipline of the phalanx was crucial. The hoplites did not run disorderly to cut down fleeing enemies. They kept their shields locked together, step by step, compressing the enemy and causing a devastating psychological effect. Persian soldiers tried to retreat, but there was no room. Escape turned into panic. This gradual encirclement caused a complete collapse of the Persian chain of command. Shouts overlapped, orders could no longer be heard, and the force that was supposed to advance found itself trapped. Many were pushed into marshy areas or back to the beach, where they crowded together trying to board ships while under attack. Some even tried to swim away in desperation, only to drown or be struck down before reaching the vessels. The planned pincer formation proved lethal. In just a short time, an army that had seemed invincible was completely disorganized. Besides tactical intelligence, another important factor in the success of this maneuver was knowledge of the terrain. The Greeks knew exactly where the firm ground lay and how to use the marshy areas to hinder enemy movement. This further limited the Persians' ability to maneuver once their flanks began to collapse. The combination of discipline, geographical knowledge, and unified command made the stretched line and pincer closure one of the most brilliant tactical innovations in ancient military history. In the end, Miltiades' strategy not only saved Athens from destruction, but also forever changed the way war would be conceived. At Marathon, he proved that the intelligent use of available forces, combined with courage and perfect execution, could defeat an enemy that seemed insurmountable. From then on, this battle became a classic example of how cunning can overcome numerical superiority. When the Persian flanks began to collapse under the relentless pressure of the hoplites, what followed was a complete breakdown of the enemy's organization. The Persian army, until then feared for its size and reputation, found itself trapped with no room to react. Panic spread quickly among the soldiers, who began to retreat in disorder toward the beach, desperately trying to reach the anchored ships. The Persian center, which at first seemed on the verge of breaking through the Greek line, was now isolated, compressed, and under attack from three sides. With no clear lines of command and their formation destroyed, every man began to fight for his own survival, and the discipline that had sustained that military machine crumbled under the siege. The scene on the plain of Marathon became absolute chaos. Men stumbled over their own companions, slipped on the dry, dusty ground now mixed with blood, and the pressure of the Greek ranks pushed many into marshy areas, where they became stuck and were cut down with no chance of defense. Persian trumpets tried in vain to reorganize the troops, but the mass of retreating men no longer responded to commands. It was every man for himself, and even the most experienced soldiers were forced to abandon their positions to escape the trap closing around them. Toward the beach, the confusion intensified. The Persian fleet, which had been their guarantee of retreat, now became their only possible refuge. Desperate soldiers threw themselves into the sea trying to swim to the ships, while others tried to board by force, creating chaos on the improvised gangways. Many died by drowning, crushed by the crowd, or struck down by Greek spears and swords as the hoplites continued their advance, giving the enemy no chance to recover. Some ships managed to set sail, but others were captured or burned while Persians were still trying to embark. This moment of flight revealed one of the Persian army's greatest weaknesses: its overconfidence in numerical superiority and intimidation. When the element of surprise and cohesion was lost, the retreat became a disaster. The field, once filled with the perfect order of Persian camps, was transformed into an improvised graveyard, with abandoned equipment, scattered bodies, and the trail of an army that, for the first time, had tasted defeat on Greek soil. The Greeks, despite their victory, maintained discipline until the very end. They did not scatter to plunder or chase fugitives more than necessary. They stayed organized, ensuring the enemy was driven away from the coast and that no group could regroup. After driving out the Persians and capturing several ships, the hoplites returned to their initial position, fully aware that the victory at Marathon was just one step in a war that could still continue. The Persian retreat at Marathon was not just a military setback. It became a symbol of the end of the myth of Persian invincibility. The sight of those ships sailing away in haste, carrying the survivors who had managed to escape, was engraved in the memory of the Athenians as proof that even against overwhelming odds, determination and strategy could prevail. That image of disorder and flight would be remembered for generations as the moment when Persia, for the first time, came to know fear on Greek soil. The final balance of the Battle of Marathon is a striking portrait of the difference between discipline and numbers, and of how the unexpected can turn into a massacre in just a few hours. When the fighting ended and the Persians retreated to their ships, the battlefield was covered with the dead. According to Herodotus and other ancient sources, it is estimated that more than 6,000 Persian soldiers were killed in the confrontation, while on the Greek side, the losses were surprisingly small, around 192 hoplites, a number almost symbolic when compared to the size of the threat they had faced. This impressive disproportion shocked the ancient world, as it seemed impossible that such a much smaller force could inflict so much damage on an army considered invincible. The Persian casualties were a direct result of the collapse of their formation. When discipline broke down and the troops began to retreat, they became easy targets for the hoplites, who advanced methodically without losing cohesion. Many Persians died trying to escape. Others were trapped in marshy areas or crushed in the confusion of the retreat. The temporary absence of the cavalry, combined with the Greeks' efficient blockade, meant there was no cover for the escape, further increasing the losses. In addition to the deaths on the battlefield, there were also losses during embarkation, with ships captured by the Athenians, who managed to seize some vessels and set others on fire. On the Greek side, the minimal losses were not due to luck, but to the way the battle was conducted. The initial charge reduced the impact of Persian arrows, which could have wiped out hundreds even before contact. By forcing hand-to-hand combat, the Greeks fought in the terrain where they had the greatest advantage. Even so, the deaths among the hoplites carried enormous symbolic weight. The names of fallen citizens were recorded, and their sacrifice became remembered as part of the very identity of Athens. Many were buried on the battlefield itself, in the famous tumulus of Marathon, a monument built not for kings, but for citizens who defended their land. The victory had an immediate impact on Greek morale. For the first time, Athens had defeated the greatest empire in the world in a clear and undeniable way. This raised the city's confidence to unprecedented levels, marking the beginning of a period in which Athens began to see itself not just as one among many polis, but as the leader of a greater cause, the defender of Hellenic freedom against foreign tyranny. The victory at Marathon was a turning point. If before the Greek cities viewed the Persians as an unstoppable force, now they knew that courage and strategy could prevail. For the Persians, the losses at Marathon were a deep blow to their prestige. They not only lost men and ships, but also suffered a moral defeat before the world. Darius I, upon receiving the news, was furious, but also understood that this war was far from over. The defeat did not erase the strength of the empire, but it shattered the myth of invulnerability. The impact of this battle was so great that its name would forever be a symbol of resistance and courage. And for Athens, the dead at Marathon became martyrs of a new era. Among all the stories that emerged from the Battle of Marathon, none is as famous as that of the messenger who ran to deliver the news of victory to Athens. According to tradition, after the Persians were defeated and expelled from the battlefield, the Athenian generals knew there was still an immediate threat. The Persian fleet could try to sail around the coast and reach the unprotected city before the Greek army could return. It was necessary to warn the population to close the gates, prepare the defenses, and prevent panic from opening the way for internal betrayal. To accomplish this vital mission, a man is said to have run non-stop from the plain of Marathon to Athens, covering about 40 kilometers in a single effort, only to announce the victory and collapse dead, right after uttering his final words. The name most often associated with this legend is Pheidipides, an Athenian runner known for his extraordinary endurance. Some accounts state that he had already performed an incredible feat just a few days earlier. He was the messenger sent to Sparta to ask for help, covering nearly 240 kilometers in only 2 days, crossing mountains and valleys to deliver the urgent plea. When the battle ended and the Persian fleet fled toward the sea, Pheidipides was called upon once more, this time to cover the distance between Marathon and Athens as fast as possible. Without resting from the battle, he set off running, carrying on his feet the most important news in the history of his city. Upon reaching the gates of Athens, exhausted, tradition says that Pheidipides gathered his last strength and shouted, "We have won!" or in Greek, "Nenike kamen." Immediately afterward, he collapsed, consumed by the effort. His sacrifice, whether real or legendary, became a symbol of Athenian determination and the urgency of that victory. Thanks to the warning, The city was able to prepare and prevent the Persians from attempting a surprise landing, consolidating safety after one of the most critical moments it had ever faced. Historically, there is debate among scholars about the details of this story. Some ancient authors, such as Herodotus, mention only Pheidippides' run to Sparta before the battle and make no reference to his final run from Marathon to Athens. Others, such as Plutarch and Lucian, writing centuries later, associated the feat with the announcement of victory. This blend of facts and legend transformed the figure of the messenger into an almost mythical hero, a symbol of extreme effort on behalf of his homeland. Whether or not the scene happened exactly as we know it is less important than what it represents. The influence of this episode has crossed the centuries and reached modern times, when the athletic race called the Marathon was created in honor of that legendary run. Today, every time a runner crosses the finish line after 42 kilometers, it symbolically echoes the spirit of that messenger, who in a moment of urgency and sacrifice ensured that the victory at Marathon was not only a triumph on the battlefield, but also a triumph in the defense of the city. The episode of Marathon was also marked by the absence of Sparta at the most decisive moment, something that generated great curiosity in antiquity and was explained by the rigid Spartan religious traditions. When the Athenians learned of the Persian landing, they immediately sent a runner, Pheidippides, to ask Sparta for help. The distance between the two cities was immense, but the messenger arrived in just 2 days, reporting the imminent danger and pleading for reinforcements. The Spartans listened to the request and, according to the accounts, were impressed by the courage of the Athenians in facing such a powerful enemy. However, at that time, one of the most sacred festivals of their culture was taking place, the Carneia. The Carneia were religious festivals dedicated to the god Apollo, held every year at the end of summer. By tradition, during this period, Sparta entered a kind of military suspension. Religious law forbade kings and citizens from starting military campaigns before the end of the festival, which only concluded with the full moon. This tradition was followed with extreme rigor because, for the Spartans, religious discipline was as fundamental as military discipline. Even in the face of such a great external threat, they believed that violating a sacred ritual would bring the wrath of the gods and endanger not only the city, but also the spiritual balance of all Laconia. This decision, seen by many Greeks as strange and unacceptable at such a critical moment, shows how the ancient world was deeply marked by the relationship between war and religion. For the Spartans, war could only be waged with the favor of the gods, and any disobedience to divine laws was equivalent to fighting doomed to failure. Thus, the Spartan king explained to Pheidippides that they would send help, but only when the moon was full. In practice, this meant that Athens would have to face the battle alone. When the battle ended, the Spartan reinforcements arrived at the plain of Marathon just a few days later. They found the field covered with Persian bodies and saw with their own eyes what had happened. Athens, without anyone's help, had defeated the greatest military power of the known world. Herodotus reports that the Spartans were deeply impressed by this feat and paid homage to the fallen Athenians, recognizing the courage of that act. Their absence during the battle was not interpreted as cowardice, but as obedience to an unbreakable religious principle. This delay, however, had an important indirect consequence. It further elevated Athens' prestige among the Greek cities. The victory at Marathon, achieved without the support of the famous Spartan warriors, showed that the polis not only had its own military capability, but also a determination capable of overcoming the greatest difficulties. The episode of the Carneia would be remembered for a long time as a lesson in how much religion influenced political and military decisions in ancient Greece, and how the outcome of war sometimes depended more on belief than on weapons. The victory at Marathon brought immediate and profound consequences for Athens, both militarily and psychologically. On the day following the battle, the prevailing feeling among the survivors was one of something almost unbelievable. A small city-state, practically on its own, had defeated the greatest empire the world had ever known. This victory completely transformed the way Athenians saw themselves. If Athens had already been proud of its freedom and its newly built democracy, now, after Marathon, that confidence turned into a sense of destiny, a conviction that their city was destined to lead the defense of Greece and to protect the very idea of autonomy against any foreign tyranny. The psychological impact of this feat cannot be underestimated. With each citizen returning to Athens alive, With every story told about the battlefield, the belief grew that nothing was impossible when fighting for something greater than one's own life. Marathon became a name that carried the weight of resistance and courage. At the same time, the fear that had hung over the city was replaced by a collective pride that raised the morale of its inhabitants to an unprecedented level. This newfound confidence had an immediate political effect. It further strengthened democracy because the citizens came to believe that it was they themselves, through their active participation, who defended and sustained the city. In the military field, the victory brought a valuable lesson to all of Greece. Persian power was not invincible. This realization had a contagious effect among the other polis. Many cities once intimidated by the prestige of the Eastern Empire began to reconsider their stance and to believe that, if united and disciplined, they could resist. The Athenian success at Marathon, achieved even without Sparta's help, became living proof that courage and strategy could overcome any numerical superiority. Another immediate consequence was the need to prepare for what was to come. Despite the great victory, the Athenians knew that Darius would not give up easily. It was only a matter of time before a new invasion was planned. Thus, even as they celebrated, Athens began to invest in improving its defenses and expanding its naval fleet, understanding that the seas would be decisive in future battles. This lesson would prove vital years later, when the Persians returned under the command of Xerxes. The victory also created heroes and symbols. The tomb built on the plain of Marathon, the tumulus, became a sacred place, not for kings or aristocrats, but for ordinary citizens who gave their lives for their city. This gesture was a powerful statement of the value of the citizen in the new Athenian society. Marathon became at that moment a living myth, proof that unity, discipline, and love of freedom could change the destiny of a people. This confidence would define the entire classical period of Greece, serving as the foundation for the cultural, artistic, and philosophical growth that would make Athens one of the most influential centers of the ancient world. When the news of the defeat at Marathon reached Persian lands and the palace of Darius the First, the impact was deep and unexpected. The sovereign, who for decades had expanded his empire across 3 continents and had never known a defeat of such magnitude against such a small enemy, received the message as a personal affront. For Darius, the Greek campaign was not just a military expedition, it was a punitive act, a demonstration of Persia's overwhelming power. To see his fleet return with thousands of dead and ships destroyed after being repelled by a city that did not even have a permanent army was a stain on his authority that he was not willing to forget. Ancient sources report that Darius's anger was immediate. He ordered that the names of Athens and its allies be recorded as priority targets for future campaigns, vowing that the city would be destroyed. If before the invasion had been a punishment for supporting the Ionian revolt, now it had become a matter of honor to restore the image of Persian invincibility. The king, known for his cold strategic mind, immediately began planning a new expedition, even larger and more complete, that would crush any Greek resistance. This planning included expanding the fleet, reinforcing the cavalry, and ensuring that no detail was overlooked. Marathon, instead of discouraging the empire, awakened in it an even more intense desire for revenge. At the same time, the defeat brought unease to the court and among the satrapies. It was the first time that a large Persian army had failed so clearly in an external campaign. The internal political consequences were subtle but real. Governors and commanders began to sense that Persian invincibility had limits. The lesson of Marathon spread silently throughout the empire, feeding a dangerous awareness that Persian military power, vast as it was not absolute. Despite his rage, Darius did not act immediately because in the period following the battle, he had to deal with other revolts in distant regions of his domain, such as in Egypt and Babylonia. These centers of instability delayed the organization of a second expedition to Greece. Nevertheless, he spent years preparing for this new attack, expanding the reach of the fleet and strengthening the administrative structures to ensure constant supplies. Vengeance against Athens had become a priority in his life. Fate, however, did not allow him to complete this personal plan. Before he could launch the new campaign, Darius died in 486 before Christ. The mission of avenging Marathon was then inherited by his son Xerxes, who reorganized everything on a much larger scale, giving rise to the Second Persian War and to the confrontations that would lead to Thermopylae, Artemisium, and Salamis. Thus, the repercussion of the defeat at Marathon was not merely a feeling of shame for Persia, it was the seed that grew into an even larger conflict, where glory and revenge would be sought on a scale never seen before. The memory of Marathon remained alive in the golden halls of Persepolis as a constant reminder that the greatest power in the world had been humiliated by a small but determined people. This open wound to Persian pride would later guide one of the largest military campaigns of antiquity. The Battle of Marathon went beyond the boundaries of the battlefield to become a cultural symbol that shaped the identity of Greece for centuries. From the days that followed the victory, the episode ceased to be merely a military feat and began to be told as an epic, an almost mythical act in which ordinary citizens, motivated by their freedom, defeated an empire considered invincible. For the Athenians, Marathon became the milestone of the birth of a new collective consciousness, the idea that the courage and valor of a people could overcome an overwhelming number of enemies. This mindset spread like wildfire among the other Greek cities and was consolidated in Hellenic culture as the ultimate example of resistance. The cultural impact was immediate on Athenian public life. Poets and orators began to exalt the feat in assemblies, festivals, and commemorations. Monuments were erected not only in honor of the dead, but as eternal symbols of what had been achieved there, the preservation of the polis's autonomy and the dignity of its people. The famous tumulus of Marathon, where the hoplites who fell in the battle were buried, became a sacred site visited by generations who paid tribute not to kings or generals, but to citizens who had placed their city above themselves. This gesture marked a cultural turning point, reinforcing the notion that the defense of freedom was a duty shared by all. In addition, Marathon definitively entered collective memory as living proof of the value of the emerging democracy. The Athenians came to associate their victory with their form of government, which gave them voice and participation, and with the fact that they fought as citizens and not as subjects of a monarch. This perspective, reinforced by the stark difference between Greek and Persian values, helped shape a cultural discourse that opposed freedom to tyranny. From then on, this opposition would become a recurring theme in Greek literature, theatre, and philosophy, inspiring texts that still echo to this day. The feat also crossed borders. In several Greek cities, Marathon came to be remembered as an event that proved that unity, even if temporary, could save Hellas. Over the decades, historians like Herodotus recorded the battle not only as a factual account, but as a narrative of collective courage, giving it an almost epic weight. At the same time, sophists, philosophers, and poets used this episode as an example of virtue, teaching that discipline and bravery were qualities capable of changing the course of history. Centuries later, Marathon would continue to be a symbol. The word became synonymous with endurance, effort, and overcoming limits. Even in modern times, the memory of the messenger who ran to announce the victory inspired the creation of the marathon race, transforming this feat into a universal reference. What began as an uneven clash on a Greek plain became a lasting myth, one of the most powerful stories about freedom ever told. In essence, the cultural impact of Marathon was to elevate the battle to a level beyond war. It became a constant reminder that a free people is capable of facing any force, and that collective courage can become immortal when guided by ideals that surpass fear. The victory at Marathon, as grand as it was, did not end the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians. On the contrary, it was only the first great chapter of a much larger confrontation that would enter history as the Persian Wars. The humiliation suffered by Darius I fed a burning desire for revenge throughout the Persian court. If the expedition had initially aimed to punish Athens and Eretria, what was now being planned was a full-scale invasion to subjugate all of Greece once and for all. However, for a few years, this plan was delayed due to internal revolts in the empire, especially in Egypt and Babylonia, and because of Darius's own death in 486 before Christ. It fell to his son Xerxes to resume the mission of completing what his father had failed to achieve. When Xerxes took the throne, he inherited an even richer and more powerful empire, but also the responsibility of restoring Persian honor. Determined to erase the defeat at Marathon, he spent years preparing the largest invasion Greece had ever seen. Thousands of ships were built, floating bridges were designed to cross the Hellespont, and roads were reinforced to ensure a constant supply chain for a force that would gather hundreds of thousands of soldiers from all regions under Persian rule. Unlike the previous expedition, this new campaign would not be a quick operation. It would be a slow and overwhelming march, aimed at crushing all Hellenic resistance. In 480 before Christ, 10 years after Marathon, this colossal force began its advance. The first barrier it faced was at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where a small contingent of Spartans, led by King Leonidas, along with Greek allies, positioned themselves to hold the passage. This battle, which would become legendary, showed that Greek courage was not limited to Athens. Although the Spartans and their allies were ultimately defeated, their heroic resistance slowed the Persian advance and bought time for the Greek cities to organize themselves. Soon after, the Persians advanced and captured Athens, setting it ablaze. But the conflict was far from over. While the city burned, the Athenians had evacuated the population to the island of Salamis and reorganized their naval fleet. The next great clash would take place at sea, in a battle that would redefine the war. Salamis. Using their newly built naval expertise and under the command of Themistocles, the Greek fleet lured the Persians into a narrow strait where their enormous number of ships became a disadvantage. The Greek victory at Salamis destroyed much of the Persian fleet and marked the beginning of the definitive turning point of the conflict. The Persian wars did not end there. The following year, the Greeks would again defeat the Persian forces at the Battle of Plataea, consolidating the freedom of Greece. However, all these developments, this resistance and these later victories were only possible because in 490 before Christ, on the plain of Marathon, Athens proved that Persia could be defeated. That battle became the spark that ignited the flame of Greek unity against a common enemy. Thus, Marathon was not just an isolated episode, but the prelude to a sequence of confrontations that would define the destiny of Western civilization. Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea are inseparable names in this story, but all of them ultimately were born from the courage of those 10,000 citizens who one day decided to face an entire empire alone on the shores of the Aegean Sea. After the victory at Marathon, the Greeks, and especially the Athenians, understood that the success of that battle did not mean the end of the Persian threat. On the contrary, everyone knew that the defeat of the greatest empire in the world would be avenged with even greater fury. This awareness led Athens and other Greek cities to begin a profound transformation in the way they prepared for war. Marathon had demonstrated the effectiveness of the hoplite phalanx, but it had also revealed the weaknesses of an army composed only of citizen soldiers summoned in times of crisis. Thus began the consolidation of a new military mentality, more professional, more organized, and much better prepared for a prolonged conflict. The first great lesson was the importance of physical conditioning and discipline. Hoplites were already known for their endurance, but after Marathon training became more frequent and systematic, running in armor became common, since the celebrated rapid charge at Marathon had proven decisive in reducing the impact of enemy archers. Learning to maintain formation under stress, endure heat and the weight of armor for long periods, and coordinate maneuvers with precision became standard practice, not just an emergency tactic. Another major change came with the realization that the future of wars would not be limited to land. If Marathon had been fought on solid ground, the Persian threat made it clear that the sea would inevitably become a battlefield. Thus, the Athenians began to invest increasingly in building a powerful fleet. This process would gain momentum years later, when Themistocles convinced the city to use the wealth from the silver mines of Laurion to build hundreds of triremes. Naval warfare became a priority, transforming Athens into the leading maritime power of Greece. The lesson of Marathon was clear. The defense of a city-state could not depend solely on its walls or its infantry. It needed to be ready to fight on any terrain. Furthermore, the battle also influenced the creation of new mobilization strategies. It became evident that quick reaction was essential. In Marathon, Athens had only managed to stop the Persian advance because it marched quickly to intercept the enemy before they reached the city walls. From that point on, Greek cities began to develop faster systems of summoning and organizing their forces, ensuring that any threat could be countered without delay. This spirit of readiness spread not only in Athens, but across many polis concerned about the next Persian strike. The pride from victory and the fear of retaliation created a culture in which military training ceased to be just a duty and became an integral part of civic life. The generation that fought at Marathon inspired the next to prepare better, refine their techniques, and see in collective discipline the key to facing larger armies. This evolution turned Greece into a much more prepared land for the battles to come, making possible the heroic resistances at Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. In short, Marathon was an awakening. It proved that courage could triumph, but also that it was necessary to be ready for an enemy that would return stronger. From that moment on, military training ceased to be occasional and became a policy of survival for Athens and for all of Hellas. The victory at Marathon gave rise to a concept that until then had never been so clearly defined among the Greeks: the idea of collective resistance, something that went beyond loyalty to one's own polis and became a sense of belonging to a common destiny. Before this confrontation, the Greek cities were accustomed to rivaling one another, competing for trade routes, political influence, and cultural dominance. Each city was self-sufficient and rarely saw a greater reason to act together. Marathon changed this paradigm because for the first time, an external threat showed them that alone they could fall one by one, but together they were capable of facing even the most powerful of empires. This spirit of Greek resistance was not born as an abstract ideal. It was forged on the battlefield. At Marathon, Athens and Plataea fought side by side, confronting together an enemy that was greater than any local rivalry. This example showed the rest of Hellas that there was something stronger than internal conflicts, something that could unite them when freedom itself was at stake. The victory, even if achieved only by two cities, was celebrated throughout Greece as a deed that represented all Hellenes, and not just the Athenians. Over time, this notion of resistance became a cultural discourse that would nurture alliances in the years that followed. When, a decade later, the Persians returned under the command of Xerxes, many cities, even reluctantly, remembered Marathon and joined efforts to resist. Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea were direct consequences of that same impulse, the realization that in the face of a foreign threat, the Greek cities had to set aside their internal rivalries and fight as one. The concept of Greek resistance also left deep marks on the mentality of the citizens. A new perception began to arise that Hellenic freedom was not a privilege granted by the gods, but something that had to be earned and protected with blood and effort. This awareness gave birth to a pride that lay not only in victory, but in the act of resisting, even when everything seemed lost. Marathon, therefore, became a metaphor for the determination not to submit, even in the face of overwhelming forces. This legacy did not end with the years of the Persian Wars. The idea of collective resistance would become, over the following centuries, a reference point for the political and military culture of Greece. It would inspire orators, philosophers, and poets to exalt unity in the face of external danger and to value sacrifice for the common good. Symbolically, Marathon planted the seed of a Hellenic national consciousness, even though the word nation did not exist in the way we understand it today. Therefore, the great heritage of Marathon was not only victory, but the creation of an enduring concept: Greek resistance. From that day on, Greece learned that even amid its divisions, there was something greater to protect, something capable of uniting them when the very essence of their freedom was under threat. After the victory at Marathon, Athens went through a profound transformation, both political and military, which projected it decisively as the dominant power of the Greek world in the years that followed. Until that moment, Athens was already known as an innovative polis, a pioneer in building a democratic system, but it had not yet consolidated itself as a reference military force. Marathon proved that this city could defend itself alone against a gigantic empire, and this newly acquired confidence forever changed the way Athenians saw themselves and how they were seen by other Greek cities. Politically, the prestige Athens gained gave even more strength to its democratic institutions. The victory was not attributed to a single king or leader, but to the collective effort of citizen soldiers who fought united. This experience strengthened the idea that the city's power came from its population and not from a restricted elite. In the following years, Athenian democracy gained momentum, creating more solid mechanisms for popular participation and expanding the influence of the assemblies in decisions of war and government. The notion that every citizen had a direct responsibility in the defense and destiny of Athens became one of the pillars of its political culture. Militarily, Athenian leaders understood that Marathon had been only the beginning. Even with the victory, they knew that the Persians would return more organized and in even greater numbers. Therefore, they began to rethink their defense strategies. The main change was the decision to invest massively in building a powerful fleet. Until then, the hoplite army had been the city's greatest weapon, but the Persian campaigns had shown the absolute importance of maritime dominance. This strategic thinking gained force mainly under the influence of Themistocles, who advocated the construction of hundreds of triremes, fast and lethal ships, using resources from the silver mines of Laurion. This fleet would prove decisive in the following decade during the naval battle of Salamis. In addition to strengthening the navy, Athens also began training its forces more intensively. Military preparation was no longer just an emergency response and became a constant practice. The episode of Marathon proved the value of speed and discipline, leading to an emphasis on physical training, tactical coordination, and readiness to act at any moment. This professionalization, combined with the new fleet, transformed Athens into a city prepared to fight both on land and at sea. From a social and cultural perspective, the victory at Marathon acted as a catalyst for an explosion of creative confidence. In the decades that followed, Athens would become the most vibrant intellectual and artistic center of the Greek world, a place where philosophy, architecture, theater, and politics flourished in an unprecedented way. The feeling that they had saved Greece on their own gave the Athenians the conviction that they were destined to lead not only militarily, but also culturally. This mentality would become one of the driving forces of Athens' so-called Golden Age. Thus, Marathon was not just a military victory. It was the starting point of a structural transformation that prepared Athens to face future invasions and to assume a central role in the history of Western civilization. From that plain near the Aegean Sea was born not only the freedom of a city, but also the confidence that would allow the flourishing of one of the most influential cultures of all time. As the years went by, the Battle of Marathon ceased to be just a historical event and became an inexhaustible source of myths and legends that shaped the imagination of the Greek world. The grandeur of the feat, the numerical disparity between the armies, and the fact that a small city defeated the most feared power of the time created fertile ground for stories that blended with reality, transforming Marathon into an almost supernatural symbol of courage and destiny. These accounts, often passed down orally before being written, were essential to consolidate the idea that the gods themselves had protected Athens on that day. One of the most famous legends born from this episode is the appearance of divine or heroic figures on the battlefield. Ancient accounts claimed that during the clash, the god Pan was seen alongside the Greeks, spreading terror among the Persian ranks. In gratitude for this supernatural aid, the Athenians were said to have built a sanctuary in his honor after the victory. Others claimed that Theseus, the legendary hero and founder of Athens, appeared as a vision to inspire the soldiers and lead them to triumph. For a deeply religious people, these apparitions were clear signs that the city was under divine protection. Beyond these mythical figures, the narrative of the battle itself gained epic contours over time. It was said that the hoplites fought without rest, driven by a strength beyond human limits, and that the speed with which they ran during the final charge was so extraordinary that no ordinary man could ever match it. This idea eventually shaped an oral tradition in which the soldiers were almost compared to demigods. Even the legend of the messenger Phidippides, who ran to announce the victory and died of exhaustion, was romanticized over the centuries, turning a human act into an epic tale. There were also stories of omens and signs before the clash. Some ancient chroniclers recorded that, on the night before the battle, strange lights were seen in the sky and sounds of war echoed from the hills, as if the gods themselves were warning that the following day would be decisive. These signs reinforced the feeling that Marathon was not just an earthly confrontation, but a battle in which supernatural forces had a direct interest. These myths became so powerful that they took root in Athenian culture, remembered during festivals, dramatized in theatrical plays, and mentioned in political speeches to exalt the greatness of the city. Over time, what happened at Marathon became as much a historical fact as a fundamental element of Greek imagination. For the Athenians, that victory was not only the result of human strategy and courage, but also a sign that they were destined for something greater, guided and protected by divine forces. This fusion between history and myth turned Marathon into an eternal example, inspiring generations. Even in later eras, when Greece lost its political independence, the name Marathon continued to evoke the memory of a glorious past in which gods and men fought side by side for freedom. Centuries after the battle, the feat of Marathon gained an even more enduring dimension thanks to the work of Herodotus, regarded as the father of history. Writing in the 5th century before Christ, just a few decades after the clash, he gathered oral accounts, testimonies, and traditions to record in his histories what had happened on that day that changed the destiny of Greece. Herodotus not only described the movement of the armies, the strategy of the generals, and the main events of the combat, but also delved into the political and cultural background that led to that confrontation, turning Marathon into one of the best documented episodes of antiquity. The great distinguishing feature of Herodotus's narrative is that it did not limit itself to telling who won and who lost. He dedicated himself to exploring the spirit of the peoples in conflict. For him, the Battle of Marathon was not just a military contest, but a clash between ways of life. On one side, the free and decentralized world of the Greek city-states; on the other, the centralized and absolute empire of Persia. By presenting this contrast, he gave the battle a far greater meaning, one that transcended the battlefield and entered the domain of ideas. This interpretation would later become one of the foundations for the Western view of Marathon as a dividing line between freedom and tyranny. Herodotus also included in his accounts elements that humanize the episode. He highlighted the role of Miltiades, the courage of the hoplites, the sacrifice of ordinary citizens, and even acts of individual bravery that stood out in the heat of battle. At the same time, he did not fail to record the organization of the Persian army, showing respect for the greatness of the defeated enemy. This balance between military detail and cultural understanding has made his work, to this day, one of the main sources for understanding the context of the battle. It is interesting to note that Herodotus wrote at a time when the memory of Marathon was still alive. Many veterans of that battle were still living, and Athenian pride was palpable. That is why his histories are not just a distant chronicle, but a record infused with the emotional impact that this confrontation caused throughout Greece. It is through him that we know the approximate numbers, the story of the messenger's run, the political debates among the generals, the role of Plataea, and how the Athenians marched to confront an apparently invincible army. Over time, Herodotus's histories became one of the foundational works of Western historical thought, and the Battle of Marathon one of its most emblematic highlights. Thanks to him, the world never forgot what happened on that plain in 490 before Christ. His narrative became a basis for poets, playwrights, philosophers, and even soldiers of later times who studied its pages to learn not only about strategies, but also about courage, politics, and destiny. Thus, Marathon does not live only in the fields of Attica or in the oral traditions of ancient Greece. It lives in the writing of Herodotus, who turned that confrontation into an eternal legacy. The strategic legacy left by the Battle of Marathon has crossed the centuries as a classic example of how tactical intelligence, discipline, and an accurate reading of the terrain can overcome numerical superiority. From antiquity to modern times, commanders and students of the art of war have analyzed this confrontation to extract lessons that remain valid in different military contexts. The Athenian victory was built not only on courage, but on a set of bold strategic decisions that defied the logic of the time and became a model of how to think about a battle. The first fundamental lesson was the importance of initiative. Instead of waiting for the enemy to attack, Miltiades chose to surprise. He broke Persian expectations by advancing at a fast pace and, at the critical moment, turning the march into a run, nullifying the enemy's greatest weapon, its archers. This decision, seemingly risky, demonstrated that in many situations, the best defense is to seize control of the timing and location of combat. This audacity was studied and admired by generations of military leaders. Another decisive teaching came from the way Miltiades used his formation. By deliberately weakening the center and reinforcing the flanks, he turned a possible disadvantage into a perfect trap. This maneuver, known as double envelopment or the pincer movement, became one of the most copied tactics in military history. Later generals, such as Hannibal at Cannae, and even modern strategists, applied variations of this idea, proving the brilliance of the concept used at Marathon. The battle also taught the importance of terrain and the choice of battlefield. Miltiades skillfully exploited the plain of Marathon so that the Persian cavalry, its most feared weapon, could not be used to its full potential. By forcing the Persians to fight in a more limited and predictable space, he greatly reduced the advantages that the enemy would have had in open ground. This became a basic principle in military studies. Choosing where to fight can be as important as the number of soldiers you bring into battle. Logistics was another aspect valued after Marathon. Athens' ability to quickly mobilize its troops and intercept the Persians before they reached the city showed how speed of response and prior preparation can save a nation. This lesson shaped the Greek military mindset from that point onward, leading to greater organization in the summoning of troops and defensive planning. Finally, Marathon made clear the weight of morale and motivation. The Athenian soldiers fought not for a king or for riches, but for their city and their families. This psychological factor ensured absolute cohesion, turning every hoplite into part of an unbreakable whole. By contrast, the Persian army, although well-trained, was largely made up of soldiers from conquered peoples, whose emotional attachment to the campaign was weaker. This contrast directly influenced the outcome of the clash. Thus, Marathon was not merely a one-time victory, but a practical lesson in strategy that echoed through the centuries. From bold initiative to the discipline of the phalanx, from reading the terrain to the importance of morale, every detail of this confrontation became an essential chapter in the history of war. After the victory at Marathon, Athens immediately understood that this accomplishment could not simply be remembered. It had to be eternalized as part of the very identity of the city. The memory of that day began to be cultivated with an almost religious care, becoming a symbol of pride and inspiration for future generations. The first major action taken by the Athenians was to erect monuments to honor those who had fallen in the battle, especially the famous tumulus of Marathon, a large burial mound built on the very plain where the combat had taken place. In that sacred site, the 192 fallen hoplites were buried together, not as individuals, but as a collective who had given their lives for the freedom of the city. This type of tribute reinforced the notion of civic equality that Athenian democracy sought to value. Over the years, the tumulus became a place of pilgrimage and reverence. Festivals and ceremonies were held annually to honor the dead, where speeches and rituals reminded the citizens of the sacrifice made by those men. This practice was not only of religious or sentimental value, it also served as a powerful political tool, keeping alive the idea that Athenian freedom had been won with blood and that any future threat should be faced with the same courage. Beyond monuments, Marathon became a constant theme in Athenian art and culture. Paintings, sculptures, and theatrical plays celebrated the deeds of the warriors and the leadership of Miltiades, turning them into models of virtue for the young. Even in courts and in the assembly, it was common for orators to evoke the spirit of Marathon as a moral argument. Remembering that day was a reminder to citizens of their responsibility to protect the city and their way of life. The speeches of historical figures such as Pericles years later would make references to Marathon as the ultimate example of civic heroism. Another important aspect in preserving the memory was Athenian education itself. Young people were taught from an early age about the battle, learning the names of the heroes and understanding what had been at stake on that day. This teaching helped to reinforce the collective identity of the city and the idea that each generation had to be ready to repeat that feat if necessary. Over the centuries, even after Greece lost its independence to other empires, the memory of Marathon continued to be a powerful symbol. Romans, Byzantines, and even Renaissance thinkers saw in this episode an example of courage and defense of freedom. Even today, the word marathon evokes that remembrance, not only because of the sport that inherited its name, but as a universal symbol of endurance and overcoming. Thus, the city of Athens not only triumphed at Marathon, but made that victory a permanent element of its very soul. Each festival, each monument, and every story told about that day served to remind everyone that even in the face of overwhelming forces, collective courage could change the destiny of a people. The victory at Marathon was a watershed moment in the political life of the Greek world, as it transformed the way citizens understood the value of civic participation and also how the city-states began to view the necessity of cooperation in times of crisis. Before 490 before Christ, Athenian democracy was still a young system, under construction, constantly tested by internal disputes and the influence of the elites. However, what happened on the plain of Marathon proved in a concrete way that an army composed of free citizens, motivated by the defense of their homeland, could overcome even a vast empire. This experience strengthened the sense that the power of a city was directly connected to the engagement of its inhabitants in political and military life. In Athens, the consequences were immediate. The prestige of the citizen soldiers grew, and the notion of collective duty began to weigh much more heavily in public decisions. Voting and political participation ceased to be seen merely as rights and became consolidated as a responsibility for those who had proven, on the battlefield, that freedom depended on the commitment of everyone. Democracy became stronger, more reliable, and more self-assured, creating a sense of community that united rich and poor around the defense of the polis. Marathon was, therefore, the cement that solidified the idea that the city was built by the effort of all its citizens. Furthermore, Marathon began to plant the seeds of a broader way of thinking about Greek unity. Until then, the city-states had lived isolated and often in constant conflict. The battle showed that cooperation, even if temporary, could save an entire region from a common enemy. The presence of the Plataeans alongside the Athenians was a striking example of this. Two small cities, rivals in times of peace, united in a moment of emergency, and together achieved a victory that changed the destiny of all Hellas. This experience served as a model for later alliances, particularly when Persian forces returned in far greater numbers under Xerxes. Marathon also reinforced in the collective mindset the notion that fighting for freedom and autonomy was the highest civic value. The victory against all odds made the Greeks realize that they could no longer regard their independence as guaranteed. It would have to be defended and preserved at all costs. This directly influenced the decisions that years later led to the formation of military and political leagues, such as the Delian League, whose purpose was to protect Greece against the Persian threat. In summary, Marathon not only preserved Athens at that moment, but also shaped the political character of the city and left a legacy that would influence all of Greece. The battle taught that democracy could be a true force of defense, that ordinary citizens had an essential role in history, and that in the face of an external threat, internal rivalries had to be set aside. This more mature and united vision of the role of the citizen and the community would become one of the deepest legacies of that confrontation. The Battle of Marathon was not merely a military clash. It became a turning point for the entire history of the Western world. In a single morning in the year 490 before Christ, Greece proved that the courage, strategy, and discipline of ordinary citizens could defeat the greatest power on earth. This victory prevented the Persian Empire from crushing Athens at the very dawn of its democracy and preserved a political and cultural model that, as it developed, would forever influence the path of Western civilization. Had Marathon ended with a Persian victory, it is possible that the history of democracy, philosophy, the arts, and even political freedom in Greece would have been interrupted or profoundly altered. The battle represented the triumph of the concept of freedom over tyranny, a confrontation that at the time was seen as a clash of two worlds, the decentralized, autonomous, and innovative world of the Greek city-states against the immense, centralized, and absolute order of the empire. By resisting, the Athenians showed that a people willing to fight for what they believe in can change the balance of power, even when the odds are overwhelming. This idea that it is not numbers that prevail, but determination and unity, has crossed the centuries and remains a universal symbol to this day. Furthermore, Marathon inspired an entire generation. From that moment on, Athens took on a leadership role, built a powerful navy, consolidated its democracy, and gave rise to an unprecedented cultural period known as the Golden Age. Architecture, philosophy, theater, and science flourished in a society that was conscious that its freedom had been won on the battlefield. Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea would later be direct consequences of this spirit of resistance that was born at Marathon. The legacy of the battle also transcends the political and military spheres. It became a myth. Historians, poets, and philosophers turned it into an immortal example of collective courage, teaching that a city united around an ideal is capable of facing any adversity. Even the modern marathon as a sporting event exists to honor this episode, keeping alive the memory of the messenger who ran to announce the victory. For all these reasons, Marathon is more than a military victory. It is a civilizational milestone. On that plain by the Aegean Sea, a group of citizens armed only with their discipline and the determination to protect their homes and their freedom changed the course of history. And by changing the history of Greece, they also changed the destiny of Western civilization.